Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of History of Chivalry and the Crusades by G.P.R. James. Chapter 13.
For some time, the Christians of the Holy Land enjoyed an interval of repose. Saladin was a religious observer of his word, and during the short space that intervened between the departure of Richard Coeur de Lion and the death of his great adversary, the Latins received the full benefit of the treaty which had been executed between those monarchs. A year had scarcely elapsed ere Saladin was seized with a mortal sickness, and, finding his end approaching, he commanded the Black Standard, which had so often led the way to victory, to be taken down and replaced by the shroud which was to wrap his body in the grave. This was then borne through the streets, while the criers called all men to behold what Saladin, the mighty conqueror, carried away with him of all his vast dominion. Saladin died, a monarch in whose character, though the good was not unmixed with evil, the great qualities so far preponderated that they overbalanced the effects of a barbarous epoch and a barbarous religion, and left in him a splendid exception to most of the vices of his age, his country, and his creed. At that period, the principle of hereditary succession was not very clearly ascertained either in Europe or in Asia, and the vast monarchy which Saladin had been enabled to consolidate was broken in pieces at his death. Saif-ed-Din, his brother, took possession of the greater part of Syria and strengthened himself by the soldiers of his dead relative, who both loved and esteemed him. 3 of the great monarch's sons seized upon such portions of their father's dominions as they could reach, and civil dissensions followed, highly detrimental to the power of the Moslem and favorable to the security of the Christians. This, indeed, was the moment when a crusade was most practicable, and Pope Celestine III exhorted all Christendom to snatch the opportunity. In most instances, his call fell upon cold and unwilling ears. Philip Augustus was too deeply engaged in those vast and magnificent schemes which, however impeded by the prejudices of the day, rendered his reign a great epoch in the history of nations. Richard Coeur de Lion had learned the danger of quitting his own kingdom, and the vanity of hoping for union among ambitious men. Henry of Germany alone, moved by wild schemes for aggrandizing his territories, assented at once to the crusade, but finding that Sicily seemed ready to receive him, he deemed the nearer conquest the more advisable, and on the same principle he had taken the cross, he abandoned it again. Not so his subjects. An immense number of the vassals followed eagerly the road which he had quitted, and several Teutonic bishops, with the Dukes of Saxony, Brabant, and Bavaria, set out from Germany and reached Acre in safety. The Christians of Palestine were at that moment in the enjoyment of peace, and they beheld the coming of new crusaders with horror and despair. Had the troops that arrived been sufficient, indeed, to give anything like certainty to their enterprise, all the Latins of the Holy Land would willingly have concurred. But the prospect of new and desolating wars, waged by scanty forces, was, notwithstanding the dissensions of their enemies, a hopeless and painful anticipation. Nevertheless, the Germans began their operations at once, and Saif-ed-Din, with his whole attention suddenly directed to the Christians, showed by the energetic activity of his movements that the spirit of Saladin survived in his brother. Jaffa was taken by assault with a great slaughter of the Christians, and all promised a speedy destruction to the small remains of the Latin kingdom. Fresh succors, however, were received from Europe. The hopes of the Christians revived, and, under the command of the Duke of Saxony, they marched on towards Berytus. Saif-ed-Din hastened to meet them and attacked the Latin forces near Sidon, but his army was completely routed by the firm and steady gallantry of the Germans, and the way to Jerusalem was once more open to the followers of the cross. But the Crusaders embarrassed themselves with the siege of the castle of Thoron. The Saracens had time to recover from their panic, civil dissensions were forgotten, and while the garrison of Thoron held out with persevering valor, the Sultan of Egypt advanced to join his uncle and repel the Christian invasion. Vague rumors of immense preparation on the part of the infidels reached the besieging army. The Crusaders were, as usual, disunited among themselves. The Saracens within the castle were fighting with the coinage of despair, and at last, a sudden panic seized the leaders of the German army. They abandoned the camp in the night and, flying to Tyre, left their soldiers to follow as they could. A complete separation ensued between the Germans and the Latins, each accusing the other of treachery. While the Syrian Christians remained at Tyre, the Teutonic Crusaders proceeded to Jaffa. Thither, Saif-ed-Din pursued them, and another battle was fought, in which the Germans were once more victorious, though victory cost them the lives of many of their princes. Almost at the same time, news reached their camp of the death of the Emperor Henry. From that moment, none of the German nobles remembered aught but the election of a new emperor, and as soon as vessels could be procured, the principal barons set off for Europe. They left behind them, in Jaffa, about 20,000 of the inferior soldiers and a few knights. But the town was surprised by the Saracens on the night of the following festival of St. Martin, and the Germans, plunged in revelry and drunkenness, were slaughtered to a man. Such was the end of the German crusade in Palestine, and before proceeding to speak once more of the affairs of Europe, it may be as well to touch upon the brief and uninteresting series of events that followed in that country. Henry, Count of Champagne, who had married Isabella, the heiress of Jerusalem, had proved but an indolent monarch, and in the year 1197, at the precise moment when the Saracens had newly captured Jaffa, he was killed by falling from a window. His loss was attended by no evil consequences, for the Saracens were soon involved once more in civil dissensions by the death of Saladin's second son, Malek el-Aziz, Sultan of Egypt, and the truce with the Christians was willingly renewed. Isabella, the queen, whose grief was not even so stable as that of the Dame of Ephesus, was easily prevailed on by the Grand Master of the Order of St. John to give her thrice-widowed hand to Almeric of Lusignan, now by the cession of Richard of England, King of Cyprus. This marriage was certainly a politic one, as Cyprus afforded both a storehouse and a granary to Palestine. But the peace with the Saracens remained unbroken till the bigoted Simon de Montfort, detaching himself from another body of knights, which I shall mention hereafter, arrived at Acre and made some feeble and ineffectual incursions on the Mussulman territory. After his fruitless attempts, the truce was once more established, and lasted till the death of Almeric and Isabella, when the crowns of Jerusalem and Cyprus were again separated. The imaginary sovereignty of the Holy City now became vested in Mary, the daughter of Isabella, by Conrad of Tyre, while the kingdom of Cyprus descended to the heirs of Lusignan. According to feudal custom, it was necessary to find a husband for Mary who could defend her right, and on every account it was determined to seek one in Europe. The choice was left to Philip Augustus, and he immediately fixed upon Jean de Brienne, a noble, talented, and chivalrous knight, who willingly accepted the hand of the Lady of Palestine and that thorny crown which was held out to him from afar. The news of his coming, and the prospect of large European reinforcements to the Christians, depressed the mind of Saif-ed-Din, who had already to struggle with vast and increasing difficulties. He tendered the most advantageous terms of peace, but at that time the two great military orders may be said to have governed Palestine. They were then, as usual, contending with jealous rivalry, and the Templars, having for the moment the superiority, the offers of the Sultan were refused, because the Hospitallers counseled their acceptance. Jean de Brienne arrived and wedded Mary, but the succor that he brought was very far inferior to that which the Latins had anticipated, and the war which had begun was confined to predatory excursions on the territory of the enemy. I must now retrograde in my history for some years and speak of the affairs of Europe. No crusade, as we have seen, had been desired by the Christians of Palestine since they had enjoyed the comforts of peace, and no crusade had reached that country. But nevertheless, one of the most powerful expeditions which Europe had ever brought into the field had set out for the purpose of delivering Jerusalem. This crusade was, in the first place, instigated by the preaching of a man less mighty than Saint Bernard in oratory, and less moved by enthusiasm than Peter the Hermit. But it was encouraged by one of the most talented and most ambitious of the prelates of Rome. Fulk of Neuilly would have produced little effect had he not been supported by Innocent III, and the influence of neither the one nor the other would possibly have obtained the object desired, had not the young and enterprising Thibault, Count of Champagne, embraced the badge of the cross with his court and followers at a grand tournament to which he had invited all the neighboring princes. In the midst of their festivities, Foulques appeared and called the whole assembly to the crusade. Partly, it is probable, from the love of adventure, partly from religious feeling, Tybalt, in his 22nd year, assumed the cross. The Count of Blois, who was present, followed his example, and of 1,800 knights who held vassalage under the Lord of Champagne, scarcely enough were left to maintain the territories of their sovereign. Nothing, except fear, is so contagious as enthusiasm. The spirit of crusading was revived in a wonderfully short time. The Count of Flanders, with various other persons, took the cross at Bruges, and many more knights joined them from different parts of France, among whom was Simon de Montfort, who afterward proved the detestable persecutor of the Albigeois. After holding 2 general conferences at Soissons and at Compiègne, it was determined to send messengers to Italy for the purpose of contracting with one of the great merchant states to convey the armament to the Holy Land. The choice of the city was left to the deputies, and they proceeded first to Venice, furnished with full powers from the crusading princes to conclude a treaty in their name. Venice was at that time governed by the famous Henry Dandolo, who, with the consent of the Senate, agreed not only to carry the Crusaders to Palestine for a certain sum, but also promised to take the cross himself and aid in their enterprise. Well satisfied with this arrangement, the deputed barons returned to France, but found the Count of Champagne sick of a disease which soon produced his death. After having been refused by Eudes, Duke of Burgundy, and Thibault, Count of Bar, the office of commander of the expedition was offered to Boniface, Marquis of Montferrat, and accepted. The new chief of the crusade repaired to Soissons to confer with the rest of the knights, and then proceeded to Italy to prepare for his departure. All these delays retarded their departure till the year 1202, when they set out in several bodies for Venice, and arrived safely at that city with very little difficulty. Innocent III had made infinite efforts in favor of the crusade, and, with the daring confidence of genius, had even taxed the unwilling clergy, while he merely recommended charitable subscriptions among the laity. Under such circumstances, it will be easily conceived that the voluntary donations amounted to an equal sum with the forced contributions, but what became of the whole is very difficult to determine. Certain it is that when the Crusaders arrived at Venice, not half the money could be raised among them which they had agreed to pay for the use of the Republic's transports, although the chiefs melted down their plate to supply those who had not the means to defray their passage. This poverty was attributed to the fact of various large bodies having, either by mistake or perversity, taken the way to the Holy Land by other ports, and carried with them a large part of the stipulated sum. But it does not appear that the Pope, into whose hands flowed the full tide of European alms, made any effort to relieve the Crusaders from their difficulties. In this distress, the Venetians offered to compromise their claim, and to convey the French to Palestine, on condition that they should aid in the recapture of the city of Zara, in Sclavonia, which had been snatched from the Republic some time before by the King of Hungary. With this stipulation, Dandolo, though aged and stone-blind, agreed to take the cross, and so deeply affected were the knights, both with his forbearance and gallant enthusiasm, that the iron warriors of Europe were melted to tears by the old man's noble daring. The news of this undertaking having reached Rome, the most vehement opposition was raised to any change of destination, and Innocent launched the thunders of the Church at the refractory Crusaders. Many of the chiefs, terrified by the excommunication, pronounced against those who should quit the direct road to the Holy Land to attack the possessions of a Christian prince remained in Italy. But the greater part made every preparation to second the Venetians against Zara. Before their departure, the Crusaders received envoys, the event of whose solicitations afterward gave a new character to their expedition. At the death of Manuel Comnenus, Emperor of the East, Andronicus, his brother, seized upon the throne and murdered his nephew, Alexius II, who had succeeded. Either urged by indignation or ambition, Isaac Angelus, a distant relation of the slaughtered prince, took arms against the usurper, overthrew, and put him to death, after which he in turn ascended the throne of Constantinople. His reign was not long, for at the end of 2 years, a brother named Alexius, whom he had redeemed from Turkish captivity, snatched the crown from his head, and, to incapacitate him from ruling, put out his eyes. His son, named also Alexius, made his escape from prison and fled to Italy, where he endeavored to interest the Pope in his favor. But the Church of Rome entertained small affection for the schismatic Greeks, and though Innocent wrote an impotent letter to the usurper, he showed no real favor to the unhappy prince. The young exile then turned to Philip of Suabia, then Emperor of Germany, who had married his sister Irene, and at the same time, hearing of the crusade, which was delayed at Venice, he sent deputies from Verona to the chiefs to solicit their aid against his treacherous uncle. The barons of France met his prayers with kindness, and the envoys were accompanied, on their return to the court of Philip of Suabia, by a party of the Crusaders, who were instructed to receive any proposition which Alexius might think fit to make. In the meanwhile, the knights embarked on board the Venetian galleys, round the decks of which they ranged their shields and planted their banners, and having been joined by Conrad, Bishop of Halberstadt, with a large body of German soldiers, a finer armament never sailed from any port. The chain which protected the harbor of Zara was soon broken through. The Crusaders landed, pitched their tents, and invested the city on all sides. The besiegers, as usual, were much divided among themselves, and those who had unwillingly followed the host to Zara, against the commands of the Pope, still kept up a continual schism in the camp, which produced fatal consequences to the people of the city. The morning after the disembarkation, a deputation of citizens came forth to treat with Dandolo for the capitulation of the town. The Doge replied that he could enter into no engagement without consulting his allies, and went for that purpose to the tents of the French chiefs. During his absence, those who opposed the siege persuaded the deputies from Zara that the Crusaders would not assist the Venetians in an assault. With this assurance, the Doge's reply was not waited for. The envoys returned, and the city prepared for defense. At the same time, the abbot of Vaux-Cernay presented himself to the assembled barons and commanded them, in the name of the Pope, to refrain from warring against Christians while engaged under the banners of the cross. On this the Doge angrily remonstrated. The greater part of the knights embraced his cause, and Zara, after being furiously attacked, surrendered at discretion. The town was now occupied during the winter by the army of the Crusade, and the chiefs of the French forces sent a deputation to Rome to obtain pardon for their disobedience. This was easily granted, but the Venetians, who seemed to care little about excommunication, remained under the papal censure. Notwithstanding the forgiveness they had obtained, many of the most celebrated knights quitted Zara and made their way to the Holy Land. Such desertions took place especially after the return of the deputies sent to Philip of Suabia, and it was difficult to keep the army together when it became known that its destination was likely to be changed from Acre to Constantinople. Alexius, however, offered, in case of his being re-established in his father's dominions, to place the Greek Church under the authority of the Roman pontiff, to turn the whole force of the Eastern Empire against the infidels of Palestine, and either to send thither 10,000 men and there maintain 500 knights during his life, or to lead his forces towards Jerusalem in person. Besides this, he promised to pay 200,000 marks of silver to the crusading army and to place himself in the hands of the chiefs till the city of Constantinople was retaken. These offers were so advantageous that the greater part of the barons embraced them at once, but many exclaimed loudly against the proposed interruption of the main purpose of the crusade, and many abandoned the host altogether. Alexius the usurper trembled at the news of the treaty between his nephew and the Crusaders, and sent instant ambassadors to Rome in order to engage the pontiff in his interest. Such of the chiefs as were opposed to the measure talked loudly of the papal injunction to refrain from all wars with the Christians, but it does not appear that Innocent exerted himself strenuously to turn the Latins from their design. It was far too much his desire to bring the Greek Church under the domination of the Roman See for him to dream of thwarting an enterprise backed with the solemn conditions I have mentioned. And it was not at all likely that the clear-sighted prelate should renounce absolute engagements, as Mills has supposed, for the vague hope of wringing the same from a treacherous usurper. At length, after the Venetians had demolished Zara, to prevent its falling again into the hands of their enemies, the expedition, having been joined by the Prince Alexius, set sail, and at the end of a short and easy passage, came within sight of Constantinople. The allies were instantly met by ambassadors from the emperor, who, mingling promises with threats, endeavored to drive them again from the shore, but in vain. The Crusaders demanded the restoration of Isaac and submission from the usurper, and prepared to force their landing. But before they commenced hostilities, they approached the walls of Constantinople and sailed underneath them, showing the young Alexius to the Greek people and calling to them to acknowledge their prince. No sympathy was excited, and the attack being determined on, the chiefs held a council on horseback, according to the custom of the ancient Gauls, when the order of their proceedings was regulated. The army was portioned into 7 divisions, the first of which was commanded by the Count of Flanders, and the last by the Marquis of Montferrat. Having procured a number of flat-bottomed boats, one of which was attached to every galley, the knights entered with their horses, armed at all points, and looking, as Nishida says, like statues of bronze. The archers filled the larger vessels, and it was the general understanding that each should fight as he came up. The morning was beautiful, writes the old Mareschal of Champagne, the sun beginning to rise, and the Emperor Alexius waited for them with thick battalions and a great armament. On both sides the trumpets were sounded, and each galley led on a boat. The knights sprang out of the barks, while the water was yet to their girdle, with their helmets laced and their swords in their hands. And the good archers, the sergeants, and the crossbowmen did the same wherever they happened to touch. The Greeks, at first, made great show of resistance, but when they saw the lances leveled, they turned their backs and fled. The tents and camp equipage of the fugitives fell immediately into the hands of the Crusaders, and siege was laid to the Tower of Galata, which guarded one end of the great chain wherewith the mouth of the harbor was closed. Before night, the Greeks had recovered from their panic, and some severe fighting took place ere the fort could be taken and the barrier removed. But at length, this being accomplished, the Venetians entered the port. After 10 days of continual skirmishing, a general attack was determined upon, and it was agreed that the Venetians should assail the city by sea, while the French attempted to storm the walls by land. The enterprise began on the land side against the Barbican, but so vigorously was every inch of ground disputed by the Pisans, the English and Danish mercenaries who guarded the fortifications, that though 15 French knights obtained a footing for some time on the ramparts, they were at length cast out, while 4 of their number were taken. In the meanwhile, the fleet of the Venetians advanced to the walls, and after a severe fight of missiles between the defenders and the smaller vessels which commenced the assault, the galleys themselves approached the land, and provided with high towers of wood, began to wage a nearer warfare with those upon the battlements. Still the besieged resisted with extraordinary valor, and the galleys were beaten off, when the blind chief of the Republic, armed at all points, commanded with tremendous threats in case of disobedience that his vessel should be run on shore. And then, borne out, with the standard of St. Mark before him, he led the way to victory. Shame spread through the rest of the fleet. Galley after galley was brought up close under the walls, and all the principal towers round the port were in a moment stormed and taken. Alexius made one great effort to recover the 25 towers which the Venetians had captured. But, with remorseless resolution, Dandolo set fire to the neighboring buildings, and thus raised up a fiery bulwark to his conquest. As a last resource, the emperor now issued forth to give battle to the French, and so infinite was the superiority of his numbers that the hearts of the pilgrims almost failed them. The gallant Doge of Venice no sooner heard of their danger than, abandoning the ramparts he had so nobly won, he brought his whole force to the aid of the French, declaring that he would live or die with his allies. Even after his arrival, however, the disparity was so great that the Crusaders dared not quit their close array to begin the fight. and the troops of Alexius hesitated to attack those hardy warriors whose prowess they had often witnessed. The courage of the Latins gradually increased by the indecision of their enemy, while the fears of the Greeks spread and magnified by delay, and at length Alexius abandoned the last hope of courage and retreated into the city. The weary crusaders hastened to disarm and repose themselves after a day of immense fatigues, but Alexius, having no confidence either in his own resolution or in the steadiness of his soldiery, seized what treasure he could carry and abandoned Constantinople to its fate. The coward Greeks, deserted by their chief, drew forth the miserable Isaac from his prison, and having robed the blind monarch in the long-lost purple, they seated him on the throne and sent to tell the Franks that their object was accomplished. The Crusaders would hardly believe the tidings, but dispatched 4 of their body to ascertain the truth. The envoys found Isaac enthroned in the palace of Blachernae and surrounded by as large and splendid a court as if fortune had never ceased to smile upon him. They now represented to the restored emperor the conditions of their treaty with his son, and Isaac, after some slight hesitation, accepted them as his own. He also agreed to associate the young Alexius in the throne. But as all these hard terms, especially that which implied the subjection of the Greek Church to the Roman prelate, deeply offended his subtle and revengeful subjects, he prayed the Crusaders to delay their departure till complete order was re-established. This was easily acceded to, and the Franks and Venetians, during their stay, wrote to Innocent III, excusing their having again turned from the road to Jerusalem. The Pope willingly pardoned both, but intimated that to make that pardon efficacious, they must be responsible that the schism in the Church should be healed by the submission of the Greeks to the See of Rome. At first, the harmony between the Franks and the Greeks appeared to be great. The young Alexius paid several portions of the money which had been stipulated, and while the presence of the Latin army kept the capital in awe, he proceeded to reduce the provinces to obedience. When this was completed, however, and the tranquility of the empire seemed perfectly restored, his conduct changed towards his benefactors. A fire which broke out in the city was attributed to the French, who were at the very moment engaged in serious dispute with a party of Greeks, exasperated by an insult to their religion. The very domineering presence of the Crusaders was a continual and irritating reproach, and the Greeks began to testify no small hatred towards their armed guests. Alexius himself, ungrateful in his own nature, contending with his father about their divided sovereignty, and hesitating between the people he was called to govern and those who upheld him in the government, refused or evaded the fulfillment of many of the items in his treaty with the Latins. The chiefs soon found that they were deceived, and formally summoned the young monarch to accomplish his promises. The messengers who bore the haughty demand to a despotic court hardly escaped with their lives. And the same desultory warfare which had been waged by the emperors against each body of crusaders that had passed by Constantinople was now commenced against the Count of Flanders and his companions. 1,000 encounters took place, in which the Franks were always victorious, and though the Greeks directed a number of vessels, charged with their terrific fire against the Venetian fleet, the daring courage and conduct of the sailors freed them from the danger, and only one Pisan galley was consumed. In the meanwhile, the Greeks of the city, hating and despising a monarch who had seated himself among them by the swords of strangers, and who had drained their purses to pay the troops that held them down, seeing also that his ingratitude, even to his allies, had left him without the support by which alone he stood, suddenly rose upon Alexius and cast him into prison. Isaac himself died, it is said, of fear, and the Greeks at first elected a nobleman of a different family, named Nicholas Cannabus, but he was mild and weak, a character which little suited the times or country in which he assumed so high a station. A rival, too, existed in a man who had shown unremitting enmity to the Latins, and after a short struggle, Alexius Ducas, a cousin of the late monarch, a bold, unscrupulous villain, was proclaimed emperor. Among his first acts, though at what exact period remains in doubt, the new Alexius, who was more commonly called Mercifulus, caused the preceding Alexius to be put to death. The manner of his fate is uncertain, but the usurper had the cunning impudence to yield his victim's body a public funeral. War was now determined between the Crusaders and Murzuphlis, and the attack of the city was resolved. But previous to that attempt, the Crusaders, who were in great want of provisions, dispatched Henry, brother of the Count of Flanders, with a considerable force to Philippopoli, in order to take possession of the rich magazines which it contained. Returning loaded with spoil, he was attacked by Murzuphlis, but the Greeks scattered like deer before the Latins, and Henry rejoined his companions not only rich in booty, but in glory also. Negotiations were more than once entered into for the purpose of conciliating the differences of the Greeks and the Latins, but all proved ineffectual, and early in the spring the armies of France and Venice prepared for the attack. The first step was, as usual, a treaty between the allies to apportion the fruits of success. By this, it was determined that the whole booty should be divided equally between the French and Venetians, that 6 persons from each nation should be chosen to elect an emperor, that the Venetians should retain all the privileges they had hitherto enjoyed under the monarchs of Constantinople, and that, from whichever of the 2 nations the emperor was selected, a patriarch should be named from the other. There were various other conditions added, the principal of which were that 1/4 of the whole conquest should be given to the new emperor, besides the palaces of Bucolion and Blacherna, while the rest was divided among the French and Venetians, and that 12 persons should be selected from each nation to determine the feudal laws by which the land was to be governed, and to allot the territory in fiefs among the conquerors. On the 8th of April, 1204, the whole army, having embarked on board the ships, as had been previously concerted, attacked the city by water. The vessels approached close to the walls, and a tremendous fight began between the assailants and the besieged. But no hope smiled on the Franks. They were repelled in every direction, and those who had landed were forced to regain their vessels with precipitancy, approaching to flight. The Greeks rejoiced in novel victory, and the Franks mourned in unwonted defeat. 4 days were spent in consultations regarding a further attempt, and the chiefs, judging that no one vessel contained a sufficient number of troops to effect a successful assault on any particular spot, it was resolved to lash the ships 2 and 2 together, and thus to concentrate a greater force on each point of attack. On the 4th day, the storm was recommenced, and at first the fortune of battle seemed still in favor of the Greeks. But at length, a wind springing up drove the sea more fully into the port and brought the galleys closer to the walls. 2 of those lashed together, called the Pilgrim and the Paradise, now touched one of the towers, and from the large wooden turret with which the mast was crowned, a Venetian and a French knight named Andrew d'Arbois sprang upon the ramparts of the city. The Crusaders rushed on in multitudes, and such terror seized the Greeks that the eyes of Nishitas magnified the first knight who leaped on the walls to the unusual altitude of 50 feet. 1 Latin drove before him 100 Greeks. The defense of the gates was abandoned. The doors were forced in with blows of axes, and the knights, leading their horses from the ships, rode in and took complete possession of the city. Murzuphlis once, and only once, attempted to rally his troops before the camp he had formed in one of the open spaces of the town. But the sight of the Count of St. Paul with a small band of followers was sufficient to put him to flight, and a German having set fire to a part of the buildings, no further effort was made to oppose the victorious Crusaders. The fire was not extinguished for some time, and the Latin host, in the midst of the immense population of Constantinople, like a handful of dust in the midst of the wilderness, took possession of the purple tents of Murzuphlis, and keeping vigilant guard, passed an anxious and a fearful night, after all the fatigues and exploits of the day. 20,000 was the utmost extent of the Latin numbers, and Constantinople contained within itself 400,000 men capable of bearing arms. Each house was a citadel, which might have delayed and repelled the enemy, and each street was a defile, which might have been defended against a host. But the days of Leonidas were past, and the next morning the Latins found that Murzuphlis had fled, and that their conquest was complete. Plunder and violence, of course, ensued, but there was much less actual bloodshed than either the nature of the victory or the dangerous position of the victors might have occasioned. Fear is the most cruel of all passions, and perhaps the fact that not 2,000 persons were slain in Constantinople after the storm is a greater proof of the courage of the Latins than even the taking of the city. Many noble and generous actions mingled with the effects of that cupidity and lust which follow always upon the sack of a great town. Nicetas mentions a striking example which happened to himself, wherein a noble Venetian dedicated his whole attention to protect an ancient benefactor, and a body of Frenchmen, in the midst of the unbounded licentiousness of such a moment, were moved by a father's agony to save his daughter from some of their fellows. This is the admission of a prejudiced and inveterate enemy, and it is but fair to suppose that many such instances took place. The great evils that followed the taking of the eastern capital originated in the general command to plunder. Constantinople had accumulated within it the most precious monuments of ancient art, and these were almost all destroyed by the barbarous hands of an avaricious soldiery. Naught was spared. The bronzes, which, valueless as metal, were inestimable as the masterpieces and miracles of antique genius, were melted down and struck into miserable coin. The marble was violated with wanton brutality. All the labor of a Phidias or a Lysippus was done away in an hour, and that which had been the wonder and admiration of a world left less to show what former days had been than the earth after the deluge. In this the Latins were certainly barbarians. But in other respects, unless subtlety, deceit, vice, and cowardice can be called civilization, and courage, frankness, and honor can be considered as barbarism, the Latins deserved not the opprobrious name by which the Greeks designated them. The plunder of the city was enormous. In money, a sufficient sum was collected to distribute 20 marks to each knight, 10 to each servant of arms, and 5 to each archer. Besides this, a vast quantity of jewels and valuable merchandise was divided between the French and Venetians, and the Republic, who understood the value of such objects better than the simple Frankish soldiers, offered to buy the whole spoil from their comrades, at the rate of 400 marks for a knight's share, and in the same proportion to the rest. The booty, with a few individual instances of concealment, which were strictly punished with death when discovered, was fairly portioned out, and, after this partition, the 12 persons selected to choose an emperor proceeded to their deliberations. They were bound by oath to elect without favor the best qualified of the nobles, and after a long hesitation between the Marquis of Montferrat and the Count of Flanders, they named the latter. In all probability, the determining consideration was that Baldwin, by his immediate connection with France, was more capable of supporting the new dynasty than the Marquis, whose Italian domains could not afford such effective aid. To prevent the evil consequences of rivalry, the island of Crete and the whole of Asiatic Greece were given to Montferrat, who afterward, with the consent of Baldwin, exchanged them for the Sclavonian territory. Baldwin was then raised upon a buckler and carried to the church of St. Sophia. After a brief space of preparation, he was formally proclaimed and crowned as emperor, and according to old usage, a vase filled with ashes and a tuft of lighted wool were presented to the new monarch. As a symbol of the transitory nature of life and the vanity of greatness, emblems too applicable to himself and his dominions. For ere 2 years had passed, Baldwin had gone down into the grave, and less than the ordinary life of one man elapsed before the dynasty that he established was again overthrown.
This concludes today's reading of History of Chivalry and the Crusades by G.P.R. James. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.